information about there we go. So actually, let me go back to the title. So writing a grant narrative with impact, CAC edition. Really excited to have you all here with me. We just did a land acknowledgement and some introductions. And so we're going to dive right into a little bit more about the California Arts Council grant applications and the different programs that are there. And so here's a little bit about the CAC grants overview. Impact projects grants are probably what most people here are going to be applying for. They are kind of the baseline project-oriented arts grants in California. It's up to $25,000 for projects focused on both community engagement and impact, right? And so it's important that when you're thinking about your project, you always want to keep those frameworks around the impact projects, community engagement, and social impact. And so we'll talk a little bit about the eligibility process and why most people are probably going to want to apply for the impact project grants. And a big part of that right now is some changes to eligibility and how organizations have to be registered with the Secretary of State that we'll get into in a little bit. So the impact project grants are open to all either organizations or fiscally sponsored projects with budgets up to $3 million. So, lots of space in terms of that project, your overall organization kind of budget. And I'm going to share in the group chat a template that I put together that everybody's welcome to use and kind of just make their own copy of. That's of this year's CAC Impact Project Grant application, the specifically the narrative part of it all. And so, you're welcome to use that as a resource and a reference as we move through all of this. Some of the other grants that you all might be interested in are that there are general operating grants that are up to $30,000 that are available for organizations with budgets up to $1.5 million for presenting arts organizations or up to $5 million for arts service organizations. But so the theme with the general operating grants that's new this year, and we'll go into this a little bit more in a second, is that organizations who are applying for the general operating grants must be registered with the California Secretary of State as their own entity. And so we'll get into that a little bit more in detail in a second. It's a new development that's kind of changing the game in terms of who can or can't apply for these grants. So the other grants that are happening are the arts and youth grants. So if you work with youth, school children, all of that. So there are a specific track for those projects. However, you cannot apply for both the impact grant and the arts and youth grants. You have to choose between those two, right? And so that's going to be one of your questions. In some ways, anecdotally, I would say probably best to go with arts and youth grants if that's your specific demographic that you're working with, because it's going to be less competition than everybody else who's working in kind of the larger, more adult-oriented arts and culture playground. So all of the grants are due by June 5th. And one thing about it's a substantial grant, and there's a lot of different attachments and pieces that you have to get together for it. So I highly recommend not leaving it to June 5th if you can at all. You never know, like, again, your internet goes out, your computer crashes, whatever can happen. You put in all of that work and then boom, it's all gone. If you can get it in early, I really recommend that. And just so really pay attention to that due date and kind of managing your own time accordingly. I know probably a lot of people here are doing projects more on a volunteer basis and not its paid work. And so I think that, especially as somebody who's come from that perspective, that time management piece can be really key to making it either a stressful grant process or a fairly easy grant process. Another thing is that both grants programs are saying this year that they are prioritizing first-time grantees. And so that's not always the case, but there is a specific line in their priorities that for both of them that they're prioritizing first-time grantees. And so Just something to be aware of. It's not something to, if you have gotten these grants before, to not go for it again. But it may be for those of you who haven't gotten a grant before, this is a perfect moment to work and try to push to get that application done. And then another kind of broad thing that we'll touch base in a little bit more specifically is that the CAC is super particular, so particular about their grants and the applications. And so, like, if you do even just like the smallest thing wrong, they will just disqualify you. And part of that is that they want to have a smaller application pool. And so, I've seen people get disqualified for submitting the previous year's fiscally sponsored project MOU rather than the current year's, or, listing the wrong contact info for a certain thing, or, again, like very minute details. So, more so than most other grant applications you'll be dealing with, the CAC grant process is very detail oriented and very nitpicky in terms of how they're going to review and kind of hold your feet to the fire around, especially all of those attachments and all of the kind of more litigious and kind of annoying parts of the application, to be honest. So CAC grants eligibility. So this is really important. Applying entities cannot be an individual, an LLC, or a for-profit entity. And so this is a fairly new-ish kind of thing that they've added. They added it last year, and it's meant to, again, kind of like winnow out, I think, some of the questionable applicants. Maybe they were getting too many for-profit entities applying for arts projects and productions and all of that, sponsorships, that kind of thing. And so, especially like it's probably not going to be a problem if you're an individual and you're framing your project as being done as a project or a collective effort, right? Like in that way, you are almost an unincorporated association. I'm not a lawyer. Please don't count me as legal advice there. But you basically aren't really acting as an individual, right? You're working as this kind of unincorporated association that is working to pull off this project. You're always working in partnership on these things. It's if you have an LLC or another like an S corp or a B corp, you that's already registered for the Secretary of State. We have gotten reports that they're checking in even with your fiscal sponsors to see if you are an LLC, to see if you're a for-profit entity of some kind. Now and so there might be some wiggle room there, especially again they're checking names of your project as submitted against the LLC registration at the Secretary of State. I'm not, so I don't know exactly how they're interpreting that or like what things might be able to get through that net. But I think it's just really be aware that guidance around eligibility is very clear, kind of forefront, and might have impacts some of you that are having LLCs and kind of that nonprofit LLC fiscal sponsorship relationship. Another eligibility point, you have to be based in California, have some kind of physical address in California, and you have to have 2 years of history of arts programming here in the state, right? So you can't be bringing that from other states. You can't be, this isn't for your fresh, like you just started getting going. Now, like 2 years of art history, or history of arts programming, that gives you a lot of leeway. Did you as a nascent organization do a work in progress 2 years ago and then a full theatrical production this year, and you're gearing up for your second one now? That to me still says 2 years of arts programming history. Just be aware you're going to have to share that as a new organization when you're getting going with CAC. They're going to ask you for that 2 years of history. Also, so like we were saying, general operating grants, they have to be registered with the California Secretary of State now. And we did some kind of like just checking in on that requirement. And so, impact project grants are fine if you are not registered for the California Secretary of State, is what they said. But for general operating grants, you must be a registered organization. Now, what does that mean? So this is a brand new requirement that they're asking even fiscally sponsored projects to be this. And that means that you basically be operating legally as a nonprofit organization in the state of California. So you'd have to have a board of directors and bylaws, regular meetings, minutes, and all of the 990s and kind of financial reportings that you'd be having to do, reports to the Register of Charities, the FTB. And so it's not a light thing at all. If you do want to go for those general operating funds, if you are an IAM affiliate, Lisa wants you to know that you can just, if you're interested in going that path, reach out to her and she will help guide you through that process and help make it as successful as possible. But I will say, as somebody who's started for nonprofits, full 501c3s, it's not a small process and it's not a small amount of paperwork or annual, just overall bureaucratic hoops that you have to jump through. Again, that's a new thing this year. It's something to be watching out for. Hopefully they do not expand this requirement to other areas of the other grant programs, because it does really impact a lot of fiscally sponsored projects. And so then, impact project grants, again, do not need to be registered with the Secretary of State. We have confirmed that. And so that's really important. And if you've been operating kind of as a fiscally sponsored project and kind of a little bit more informally, that's going to be the grant that you want to look at. And just again, to reiterate, do not apply with LLCs or other for-profit entities. It seems like that's going to get you just completely nullified in terms of your application. Another little detail that's oh so fun is our fiscally sponsored letters of agreement. So this is one of the supporting documents that you have to provide if you are a fiscally sponsored project. Kind of curious, how many people, if you want to put it in the chat or raise your hand, how many folks here are working with fiscally sponsored projects versus full 501c3s? And raising hands is fiscally sponsored projects. Great. So it seems like most people responding are, maybe it's like about half and half here today. Okay, great. So those of you who are fiscally sponsored, this is something to pay attention to. You have to use their specific letter of agreement template. You cannot use your own MOU or contract. And so Model A projects, Model A projects will be a whole nother thing. So if you're a Model A fiscally sponsored project with IAM, again, just talk to Lisa and she'll make sure that you're taken care of in terms of all of that. And so again, you have to use the template that the CAC provides. You're going to find it in either the grant portal or the website, which has the links to all the different documents. So even if you have an MOU or another letter of agreement or whatever it's called that outlines your fiscally sponsored project details, you have to do the CAC version. It's a very stickler detail that they've got, again, kind of winnowing that pool. And when you're submitting this, just really make sure that you submit a version that has signatures for all sides, because we've gotten word that so there are some folks who submitted like a DocuSign version that only had a signature for one party, and that was disqualified, and it disqualified their entire application. And so this is just something to really pay some close attention to. And really just like all of their kind of more litigious details, can't emphasize enough to triple check it. Get another friend to look at it for you if you can, just to make sure, because there is no forgiveness there. Okay, so I want to stop for a second and just ask, does anybody have any questions around kind of like the CAC grant overview, the different categories and eligibility as a whole?
I have a
Yeah, Tasha.
question. Okay, so you mentioned that we can't apply for impact and arts and youth. I'm wondering if you can apply for general operating and either impact and arts and youth.
Yes, you are able to apply for both of those.
Is that like does that look weird to apply for two?
I don't think so. And I've had organizations that I worked with get both of them before on the
Oh
same grant.
wow.
So
Okay. Thank you.
I think that if you feel like you've got solid programming and want to go for both, and again, have that kind of requirement met around the Secretary of State, then absolutely go for it.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, the one thing I'll note there is right, keep your applications very separate. That like impact is very project focused, and then that Gen Ops is kind of like your whole organization overview.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Mm.
Yeah, bro.
Well, I don't know if this is the right thing for it because I didn't see it on your list, but individual artist fellowship programs. Can we sponsor like commissions for like composers and things of that nature? They seem to have that program. Is that what that's all about?
Independent Artist Fellowship Program, as far as I know, is a state-sponsored fellowship program. I looked at it briefly one time, and I don't think it was for organizations to hold their own fellowship program. I think it was for the state to that has its own fellowship program, right?
Yeah, I just I'm assuming that maybe IAM may be able to do that. I'm not sure. They might be able to work. I don't think it requires a state to be a state organization, but that's why I was asking. I may be going off the track here on that one. Maybe I should
No,
just be curious about
I'm
it.
not as familiar with that program at CAC, so I will take a look at it and I'll follow up with you separately.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions before we move into kind of a bit more about the narrative section of the CAC grant? Specifically, we're going to be going into the impact project grant because we expected that that would be the most useful for those applying here. I will say that the impact project grant application mirrors the general operating for a significant portion of it. Okay, great. All right, so some key narrative areas for the CAC grants. I've just kind of broken this up into their specific sections, and then we'll talk a little bit about some strategy, and then have a moment to dig into questions. And then after this, we're gonna get into a little bit more about the meta around storytelling in grants and kind of crafting impact-driven narratives. So your project summary is the first thing that they ask you for. I think it's 150 words. And so you have to keep it very short and sweet. And so I want you to always think about like if you were to develop a pitch, how would that go? And actually, we're gonna have that project, that activity in a little bit. I used to have it earlier in the workshop. Now we do it at the end, and so that's why it says think about those pitches you help develop. But we're gonna work on some pitches, and that's gonna help you really think about your project summary. It's going to talk quickly about the project, and you really want to focus it back in on community impact. Remember, again, this grant is all about community engagement and social impact, so you always want to hit back on that whenever you can. You want to try and make the project summary compelling from the start, however you can. This can also kind of double as a quick intro for your project or organization. Again, think about it in that kind of like elevator pitch kind of format. So then they ask you about centering equity. I have some really great news for those of you who have applied for these CAC grants before in the past few years. They've way simplified the equity section of the grants. It used to be a lot of obtuse language and kind of a focus on the like California Healthy Places Index, and they've gotten rid of that, which is really fantastic. And just makes it so that you don't have to kind of bend your language to jump through their hoops as much. And so they're asking you to describe your organization's equity and accessibility goals. What does your organization do to achieve these goals? How does your organization determine progress in achieving these goals? And then describe your organization's approach to ensuring that people with disabilities are able to fully participate in all programs and services. And so, again, this is far simplified from past years. It's really great. You know, I used to work as somebody who did equity, diversity, inclusion work with foundations, and I'm just so happy to see them going into a direction that is just far more accessible for most organizations. So that's really great. Hopefully, this is something that will be relatively easy for most people to adapt to. Does anybody have any question? I feel like, you know, in the past, I've done a little bit of like song and dance around what DEI was, but with our current national situation, I feel like DEI is front and center in the national consciousness. So does anybody have any questions about equity or kind of like how to focalize equity within the section, within the framework of a specific organization or project? Cool, great. Oh,
Sorry, I
yeah.
have a question. Yeah, just curious, like, are they looking for like all levels of accessibility, like how you're making the space physically accessible, and then also like accessible in terms of participation, I'm guessing?
Absolutely. I think that it's best to include both. You know, one thing that these programs are meant to be is accessible to the public in kind of a general sense. And so I always use these sections to talk about both physical accessibility levels and things like ASL interpretation, or you know, what other services you're doing, Spanish interpretation, things like that, as well as talking about economic accessibility. So are you doing free or sliding scale programs and admissions? And so I would think of it more, yeah, both on physical accessibility and kind of economic accessibility, maybe not so much cultural accessibility, because I think that, you know, we talk about outreach and kind of outreach to communities in other sections of the application. Right, Brett?
Yeah, I'm working on a film, and so many of the venues are pretty much out of my control. As far as accessibility for some other things, it would be like my own fundraising and such. That would not be an issue necessarily. How would I phrase it when it's actually out of my control?
Uh, I think that you do have a choice in what venues you're still working with to some degree. However, maybe you frame it as you're working with certain venues in order to have that cultural connection and kind of like that historical connection to those specific communities. I don't know what your decision making is around those venues where you're hosting. It could also be language of like, hey, we're recognizing that this venue is not accessible, but this is who offered to host us for free, and host this event for free. But I mean, I would challenge everybody that if you're using venues that are not physically accessible, like, are there venues that you could choose instead that are? Because you are, you know, not including a section of the population. And again, like, if there are reasons that you're going that path of choosing venues that are not, what are those specific reasons, and trying to lift that up as much as possible. Yeah, Ralph, and then I want to lift up some of the questions I'm getting in the chat.
Okay. Oh, are you opening me to ask the question?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Just, you're talking about accessibility in terms of ADA requirements of venues and things like that. It seems like most venues, you know, are required to have ADA access, access on their buildings. I've been relying on that. I'm assuming that that's okay. But I haven't been across any venues, any professional venues that don't have, you know, that haven't built their building to ADA standards. I'm assuming that's what they're referring to, right?
Yeah, I think that absolutely. And sorry, Brett, if I misinterpreted your question. I think ADA is kind of like the baseline that we're going for. That if you're not doing ASL or some of these other things, or if you're not having separate seating for scented versus non-scented, some of those kind of like more nuanced accessibility things, you don't really need to mention that. I do think that if you are doing venues that are not ADA for whatever reason, that mentioning those like physical barriers specifically in the accessibility section is maybe not in the grant, not but in your public facing marketing is important.
Okay.
And then I want to lift up, so Tara, I missed your question about Model C projects owned by an LLC, especially if the name of the LLC and fiscally sponsored project are different. From what I understand, what we saw last year is if the names are different, then it's okay, and that they're not really looking that deeply, that might be like kind of passing through the net a little bit. Then I'm also seeing from Jordan, since National Arts Projects Foundations are responding to the federal demands by restricting the language that's allowed to be used, does CAC foresee retroactively there being issues for orgs who center equity in music language? And so right now, as far as I understand, and I'm a part of these conversations on a bigger scale with some organizations, and like the state organizations are trying to hold their line, especially in California, and foundations are really trying to hold their line. And so, while yeah, I think we're going to see an impact on the NEA specifically. I think it's already happening. In fact, it's like I know I got messages even in this last round of grants applications that they were kind of narrowing their focus. And so we'll see it in that level. But I think, CAC does not get their funding from the NEA. It's still state funding. And so the federal government will not have any say on that at all. And yeah, Jordan, I want to say, if you want to share those resources in the chat that you were mentioning around access, we would love that. Any other questions around equity before we move on through the rest of these sections? All right, great. These are a little bit probably more straightforward. Program design and implementation. You got to choose your project topic. They kind of have their different social impact areas. Probably easiest to choose one that best fits your project as much as possible. You do have an other option where you can put in something else. Just again, make sure it's social impact focused and not, the medium that you're working in or any of that kind of thing. Then you got to provide a detailed description of your proposed project. In the past, by the way, they had your description of the project and your timeline combined. They've broken those questions out this year. And so you first have a description. It's only all of these, by the way, are about 300 words. Then you actually have to do a one-page upload of your key individuals, artistic, technical, or administrative, that are involved with the project. And you can see that, so that includes name, title, whether or not they're being funded by CAC funds. Do not forget that detail in that document. And then the role within the proposed activities, right? Again, like imagine that there's just somebody coming through with a checkbox on all of these little things that they write in these instructions, right? And actually, I just want to say, like a meta level, I, for a long time, was resistant against doing that kind of like section break where it just lists out the question or lists out the like specific subsection of the question that you're answering. I've now reversed that, especially on CAC grants. Imagine that you are a grant reviewer and you are looking at like 100 of these things in a super compressed time frame, and you're already overburdened because you're a culture worker who's working with 5 different arts organizations and has their own art project and all these things, right? Like that's probably the typical grant reviewer we're getting. It's not a compensated position. And so really like making it easy so that people can kind of scan through the application and just be like, okay, great. Did they answer this question? Did they answer this question? Did they answer this question? Right? Just on a meta level, I think that really, yes, definitely make your writing compelling. Definitely make sure you're always answering all of the questions concisely and with, as much impact and power as you can, but also make it really clear for the people who are speed reading so that they can go through and make sure that you're answering each section. And so then also provide a clear timeline of all the main arts programs or services that will take place during the grant activity period, right? So that's your, kind of making sure everything that you talk about in your description is timelined out. This is a great moment to plan and do some of your own kind of initial project planning. And then program budget. Program budget is its own huge thing. Jerica will be taking care of that on, I believe, May 7th. I'll remind everybody of the date of that workshop at the end of this one. Artistic merit. So they've shifted some things around a little bit. We no longer have a local artist section. Now it's artistic merit. So you need to provide a written statement from the lead artist or artists describing the vision for the project and the connection to the community that's going to be engaged. This is a place like they don't give a lot of instruction here. So in some ways, this is an opportunity for you to make your sell. Like really pitch the project, pitch its importance. If there's pieces of the project you feel like you're not able to talk about and the rest of the grant application, or that because you didn't get to because you're limited to 300 words, this written statement is a really fantastic place to do that work. And then also, this is where they have the work samples now, and so you need to provide at least one, but no more than 5. Support materials is what they're calling them. Support materials can be work samples, they can be letters of support, they can be marketing materials, partnership agreements. I would maybe stay away from partnership agreements because I'm not sure how that really demonstrates your aptitude at your work. But the samples must have been created within the past 3 years. So they really want that example of the history of your organization and your work. Community engagement. So most of this is the same. Some of the wording's been reworked. Describing historically and systemically under-resourced communities that you will be most deeply impacted by this project. Again, we no longer have to deal with that California lowest quartile of the HPI language, which is really great. We can really just talk about those marginalized communities we're working with that we're doing the good work for, and not have to try to frame it through this interesting but kind of strange index that is based off of geographical data. Describe how your project will address the healing, stabilizing, uplifting, and transforming of an identified community and their needs, and describe how you will center community's members' voices throughout the project, including development, implementation, and measure of success evaluation. Notice those, right? So like, I really, again, when you're answering that question, do development, implementation, evaluation as your like little subject heads. You can get like a little bit more creative than that if you want, absolutely, but really make it clear that you're addressing each of those areas. And do it in your own planning. Make sure that you are centering that community throughout each stage of your project. A little bit about the equity section. I think I might have said a chunk of this while we were going through these, so I'll try to just highlight the ones that I haven't already talked about. But so equity and community engagement are both given a lot of weight in the scoring of applications. So this is really one point, like, do not skip on this. If you are feeling like, oh, well, I have to do a stretch to really make my project feel like it's around community engagement and all of this, well, like maybe try to lens your work a little bit, talk to our friends, as somebody who knows your work well, and ask them how they think your project applies in these areas around equity and community engagement. But really try to dig as deep as you can, get as nuanced as you can, get as specific as you can in these areas. Because I promise you, there's going to be so many projects out there that really skate over equity, especially, right? that are just trying to kind of BS their way through these sections around equity and community engagement. And so if you do a really fantastic job, if you really highlight that rooted connectedness you have back to the community, it's going to help your application a lot. And so this is also a great opportunity to give more details about your partnerships. There used to actually even be a specific question about partnerships. Now there is not. And so I think that that's something to keep in mind, to like really touch base in at some point about what are the other organizations you're working with that give you access to those communities that are so core to your work. And then, you know, if you're an individual artist that's doing this and you have a fiscally sponsored project that you're applying for, you know, anytime it says your organization, you as an individual artist, well, you might hold yourself as an individual artist. We all know that producing art takes a team, right? It takes a community. It's a collaborative effort. And so, you know, really stretch and think about like you as a collective effort as much as possible. And so program design, I mean, I think we talked about this. So timeline, opportunity to plan some logistics. If you haven't done this already, I know it can be really annoying when you're like just trying to get that grant out. But honestly, I have found taking that moment to do some deep timeline planning and kind of project planning while you're doing the grant can be really helpful for you to identify what you need to get it done, even if that grant doesn't come through. And you know, make sure to touch base about how your programs are free or affordable. They ask you about this in a separate place, like, is your program free? Like, they want your programs to be free and affordable and accessible to the public. And so just in that section, make sure you just drop a little line about that. Community engagement section. Again, this is a great place to reinforce the impacts and outcomes for your project, since everything about this is about community engagement and social impact. When they're talking about community engagement, this is just a place for you to hit back in on all of those core impacts for your project. Also, so there's that question about healing and kind of nourishing with the community. This is a great opportunity to do a story. Like, I know that oftentimes we're trying to like kind of bullet point this out. We're trying to like prove like, oh, we do it X, Y, and Z and A, B, and C ways. But sometimes pausing that approach and doing a story all of a sudden about the impact that your work has had on an individual or a family or an organization, if you work with organizations, this is a really great place to do that. And honestly, you might find other questions where you have a story moment. I think we'll have time for me to go into the little bit about like why stories are important for grant writing. So this is really a good opportunity for that. Also, use the question about centering community voices to brainstorm more ways to engage your community in the process. Again, just like that timeline question asks you to kind of think about project planning, this is a great place to think about community engagement. And to touch in on evaluation and documentation, because if you do those evaluation and documentation processes well, that will just help you get the next grants or other funders. Artistic merit section. So this is primarily your lead artist statement. So I actually recommend starting with this. I know that's a little bit out of the box, but even if you just start with this as like a rough outline, it might help you get exactly into the impacts and the heart of the project you're working on, because this is about your personal vision and your personal drive for this work. And so it's up to you in terms of your work process, but I definitely have worked with people who found it really helpful to start here and kind of come back to these at different points in the questions. They're guideposts. And then you can kind of, if you do start with here, just maybe like go back to it at the end, see what's feeling repetitive, and then change anything to include things that are missing that you didn't get to talk about in the rest of the application narrative. And then again, always go back to those community impacts again, and we'll talk a little bit about impacts in a second, but it's just so key. This is all about community engagement and social impact. That's what they're really looking for. Supporting materials, you have that option of doing work samples versus letter of supports or marketing materials, all of that. I think that doing a mix, if you can, is great. But if you just do work samples, I've never seen it be a problem. I've worked with organizations that have done just work samples and never had it been a problem. I would say don't do just letters of agreement. Definitely make sure you show your work. Definitely make sure that you show in a visual way that you can execute on what you're talking about in the project application. I see that from Tracy. Yes, we will have a recording of this. It's happening right now, and so I think IAM will be sending that out. Thank you so much for being here. And so work samples, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words, but videos are thousands of pictures. So I mean, I hate to say it, but videos are just infinitely better for work samples. If you can have a video, if you don't have a video, it's okay. Don't stress. I've definitely seen folks win grants with just pictures. But you know, documentation as you're doing more grant writing, as you're doing more fundraising, documentation is so key. And you'll always want to just emphasize your documentation as you go along in your work. Again, variety is the spice of life. Great if you can do some work samples, some letters of support, all of that. Make sure that they're relevant to your current work or project. If you are working on a theater piece, don't include work samples to your visual arts projects or vice versa, right? One really wants to demonstrate your aptitude for your ability to pull off this project. And if you don't feel like you have awesome work samples right now, even if you're doing this, you're kind of cringing a little bit about your work samples, this is a great space to really purposely set aside some funds for documentation, or reach out to your friend who's a photographer and beg them to come out and do some work and documentation of your next project. Again, it's really going to help you step up that game with your grants. Work samples can really seal the deal. And that's across the board, whether it's for grants or individual fundraising or corporate sponsorships or just getting people to show up at your next event. Getting those work samples in is so important. All right, so take a quick moment. I see some folks are hopping off. I understand that we're at that hour mark. We've still got another half hour. I'm going to go into a little bit of storytelling and impact in grant writing, and then we're going to have a quick activity. But before we go into all of that, does anybody else have, or does anybody have any questions about the application narrative questions and work samples and all of that? All right. So storytelling and grant writing. And so Rebecca, I'm seeing a question about the GenOps application. The GenOps application, we don't actually have time to go over both of those in today's session. The questions in terms of like the equity and kind of community engagement sections are the same. And then it's really just a couple of different questions that are more about your general organizational activities rather than program specific that replace that program design section. Yeah. Okay, storytelling and grant writing. So why are stories important in grants? You know, I know storytelling has become a little bit hyped almost a little bit lately. And so it can feel a little bit like I'm applying for a grant. Like, why does everything have to be story driven? What's going on? Like, there's a reason why. There's a science behind stories. It's one of the oldest forms of passing knowledge. Basically, you know, when we were even like pre-verbal mammals gathered around a campfire, we were passing stories as a main way of passing on survival. Basically, the tools and knowledge that would help us survive and succeed as that kind of early human. And so they, you know, have this specific place within us, both biologically and culturally. Stories hold a place of importance throughout every culture across the earth. There's not a single culture where stories are not important. And our brains are literally hardwired for storytelling. Our brains will light up in a brighter way in different areas if information is being communicated to us via story versus as data, as kind of a disconnected series of facts, any of that. So there's just something about stories that really have a power to create empathy and human connection. And so, okay, how do you pull, your arts project that you're working on or your arts organization and create a story that you can tell in a grant? And so I think about this in terms of like your overall organizational or project story. You're going to have specific stories that you might be able to tell about, like, oh, this impacted this person in this way and X, Y, and Z happened. But what we're talking about here in terms of a grant story is really being able to take some of that story of what you're doing and translate it into the elements that our brains are looking for when it comes to storytelling. And so, sorry. Thanks, Haley. Thank you for being here. People are hopping off. Thanks, y'all. So when you're looking for all these in your grant narrative, when you're designing your grant narrative and kind of your central thrust, thinking about your characters, who are you as an artist or an organization? Who is your art or organization impacting? And in some ways, that second one is even more important than the first. Setting, what is the geographical scope of your work, or where does it take place? Conflicts, what is the problem? So what needs to be changed in the world? What are you challenging? Why is your work urgent, right? That's what we're trying to get to in that section around conflict. And then action, climax, resolution, how we think about that. Like, what are you doing to resolve your conflicts? How is it changing things? How's your project? How's your organization changing things in the world around you? And what does the future look like once it's changed? What is that resolution in the long run? And so that's, again, kind of bringing it through our current reality. What are you doing to resolve? Like, what is your actual action? And then what's the immediate impact? And then, like, what is that vision of of the future once your work has really flourished and been able to change the world? So some examples of grant story, just to give a little bit of context there, right? Pride Center, I shared you all like the characters for us when we're talking about our work is LGBTQ residents and visiting tourists of New Orleans in the South. Our setting is New Orleans, the surrounding region. That's really easy in that project. Our conflicts also, unfortunately, too easy to articulate in these times. Attacks against LGBTQ people in the South are escalating, and we need to have a safe space where our most vulnerable community members can connect to services and each other. And so, what are we doing? We are creating a new community center that will act as a hub of resources and programs, helping LGBTQ people thrive through connection. All right, so that's a nice nonprofit one. Here's a more arts-centered one. So this is, I was working on a project, Black Benatar's Black Magic Cabaret. The characters were Black Benatar, this fabulous Black drag queen, and Wyatt Ally, her well-meaning white sidekick. And then everywhere we'd have local performers. Our setting was that we would always in our grants be talking about the areas that needed racial justice the most, Midwest and the South. Our conflict was, again, this is kind of framing it not as the conflict of the plot of this artistic project, but as the conflict that we're trying to address socially. Conversations about race and cultural allyship are needed, but people refuse to engage with them because they make people uncomfortable. And so we were using magic, drag, circus arts, and puppets to disarm the audience and bring them through discomfort to a place of collective joy around race and cultural allyship. A little bit more abstract, another project that I worked on was a sculptural project called Refuse. And so here the sculptor was taking trash and discarded objects to create these large immersive sculptural presentations. And so, we had as characters, trash, discarded objects, the viewer, nature. The setting was kind of always a world overflowing with trash. And so you can see there how we use settings. Again, setting is kind of framing the conflict in a way, right? Just like it would in any story. And then conflict problem, rampant consumerism combined with cheap plastic production has made everything seem disposable, causing an epidemic of plastic pollution. And then by reusing discarded objects to create beauty, Refuse asks the viewer to redefine their relationship to trash and their own pollution footprint. And so you can kind of see how we took this kind of, again, it was just making art out of trash. You could just say, right? It's just making art out of trash. But no, actually, it's addressing these huge social impacts and trying to address these big problems within society and create a better community for us all. And so how do you always reframe back into that? And so a little bit more about impact, the secret sauce of grant storytelling. What is impact and why is it important? Definition of impact. I'm just kind of trying to move us through this quickly. So it's the force of impression of one thing on another, a significant or major effect, right? And I love that definition. Like the force of impression is both a beautiful kind of metaphor, and then also, significant or major effect really clearly says it. For grant writing, what do you need your impacts to be focused on? And so our impacts can be on individuals, communities, institutions, society systems, culture, and values, right? Our projects absolutely do have impacts all the way through that. However, when you're writing your grant stories and when you're writing your grant applications, I really think it's important to focalize your impacts through individuals and people and communities. So you want to keep your impacts people focused. And why is that important? Because going back to storytelling, we are hardwired to care about people and characters. We are not hardwired to care about things and ideas and abstractions. And so when we start to talk about our impacts in terms of institution, society, culture, and values, while for us that is important, I think it's always important to touch a little bit on that. We always want to ground back into the individuals and communities that we are working with, because that is what's going to have the most impact on our readers and the people who are reviewing our grants. And again, so impacts are important because they tell the story of why, right? Why does your project matter? Why does your organization matter? Why is it urgent in this moment? And they really should drive all of your communications, not just your grant writing. Once you get a good list of impacts for your work, that can be a framework that you can deploy throughout your social media, your website, through your individual donor campaigns, all of that, right? And so it can be really, other than your mission statement, vision statement, and values, some of your most useful writing that you do as an organization or a project. Right, and so I have some examples there. I ran a nonprofit queer retreat center in Northern California. We were holding retreats, but what were we holding retreats for? To help LGBTQ people lead healthier, more fulfilled lives. Again, I create sculptures, but I create sculptures that help people heal from consumerism through connection to nature. So again, what is the connection back into the people? You'll notice that people are in both of those impacts and kind of impact-driven mission statements. Any questions before we go into an activity? All right, we have 14 folks here, and I'm guessing everybody can still stick around for the next 15 minutes, 18 minutes, is that right? Okay, great. We're gonna split up into groups. And so actually, I want everybody to take 3 minutes really quickly. And I want you to choose either your project or your organization. If you're not sure about what project you're applying for, just pick something that you are hopeful to be applying for. And then I want you to list out 2 to 5 impacts. And so I'll share my screen again so you can see that. But so quick little moment for writing. I would put on some music really quickly. And yeah, so 3 minutes to write out 2 to 5 impacts for your project or organization based on what we've been talking about. But so everybody might not be finished, but I want us to get back in and break out into our breakout rooms and talk a little bit about our impacts and do a quick little pitch activity. And so let me share my screen again. So, all right, I like to keep it silly. I like to keep it a little queer. This is your pitch your project activity. RuPaul has a new TV show where artists and nonprofits get to pitch their ideas. They get a $25,000 grant. So I want you to use the impacts that you just listed out to quickly, let's say not draft a pitch, but just on the fly create a pitch for your project or organization. We're going to split you up into pairs and trios. So I want you to take a moment to have a 1 minute to 2 minute pitch. Have fun. Don't stress about this. But also, it's note back to those impacts, right? The person who's not pitching or people who are not pitching, take notes on what worked, what stood out. Did anything have real impact on you? That's especially what we want to get back to is how did those impacts land? So I'm going to quickly recreate the room so we have an equal room for everybody. And so I'm going to break you all out into rooms. We'll have a quick moment. We're going to come back in 7 minutes. So again, like take 1 to 2 minutes, do your pitch, get feedback, and then rotate on to the next person. I'll do a little notice when it's been 2 minutes for each person. We just gotta keep this tight. But this will be a great opportunity for you to practice your pitch, get some feedback, and then we'll come back and talk about what worked best and what didn't. Thanks, y'all. Try to get you. All right, welcome back, y'all. I would love to just hear what were folks' experiences like sharing in the small groups, what, especially around like what stood out in terms of those impacts that people were sharing. What really resonated with you?
What really resonated, what really resonated with me was the knowledge that some people had, and that some of the questions that some of the people were asking that I thought were quite relevant and quite interesting in things that I hadn't even thought of about what types of grants could be granted, as well as can you apply for more than one grant? One whole area I hadn't thought of with my project, since it is intergenerational conversation, is a youth impact. I'm like, duh, you know, of all the things to just not forget about. I guess it's what happens when you get old, you forget about. Anyway,
No, but I
next.
think why it's important to talk to other people about what you're doing, because I think it's easy for us to get into our projects within a certain framework or lensing, and you know, other people will be like, "Hey, what about this aspect?" Yeah, Ralph, please.
Yeah, we ended up with a question that I'm sure you'd be able to answer. There was a couple that we used like the youth grant and the general operating grant. You can only do one. My question is, does it mean you can only apply for one, or can you apply for both, but you only get one of them?
So it's just to be clear, you can apply for general operating and impact or youth. You cannot apply for impact and youth. So it's kind of like their project specific grants. They don't want you applying for 2 separate project grants. And there you can only apply for one. I believe that they disqualify you for both if you apply for both.
Oh, well, that's good to know.
Any other feedback from the small groups or just questions that folks have about the CAC process overall? And then Treka, I know you have a couple of things to share with folks before they go.
I do have a question, and maybe you can just tell me who to ask the question of. There are things in, and it's even just like general organizational things in the portal that don't show up in the FAQ, like what is the best way to generate a spreadsheet of the zip codes that you like, do we get disqualified if it's not formatted in a particular way? Because there are certain things like that like we've written many applications, we've never been asked for that before. And so it's just like, is there a sample of what they want? Because we can absolutely do it. anyway, there are just things like that that are, but in that case, it's not a GenOps specific one. But who is that? Just like I send them an email and say,
They do have a general contact email that you can send for that. I believe that organizations, when they've recertified and when they certified, right, y'all would have
yes,
been asked for that spreadsheet, and they did include like a little PDF sample. I just went in and used that PDF sample and just kind
I
of,
didn't see that at all, a PDF sample, but I'll
okay.
go back and look again.
Yeah, go and look, and like there was like a little sample version that they had, at least when I was looking at it earlier today, or when I was recertifying an organization earlier today. I guess the question, I was recertifying an organization. I don't know if that's
Yes.
for a newly organization, and so but there was a part that asked for that zip code, and they had like a little link to a document that gave a format, and I just used that format, even though it was not entirely. I'll be honest, I had my own questions because it said like submit a spreadsheet, but then it was also like use this template, and so I used the template because
Yes.
to me that feels like the most explicit direction.
Yes. And you know, if we know that there are zip codes that people have attended from, we can include those zip codes, but like really it could be anyone in all the zip codes in between. There's just the people that we know about, and since we offer only free events, people don't have to register with us in order to attend. So it's very much guessing. But certainly it serves the entire Bay Area. So but it feels a little weird to say, hey, all of these, like the whole.
Yeah, and also like to do all of the Bay Area zip codes, you would be doing that for a long time in order to get to all the zip codes. So one thing the language does say representative of, and does not have to be a literal thing. And so I am taking that, like they got passed down some kind of legislative mandate to collect that information is my guess. And
Yes.
they're do their best to get that information from people, and everybody's going to enter it haphazardly as best they can. And so do it as best you can. Don't spend a huge amount of time on it. It says representative. So what I was doing for this organization was like making sure I touched on the different cities and like regions and had a couple of zip codes from each of those. If you have been collecting data through like MailChimp, or like maybe you have Eventbrite.
MailChimp we have, it's just small. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so if you have any zip code data, you could theoretically like use that to create like your initial list and go from there. But again, I think that's not going to be something that's going to be taken as a factor for your application so much as just making sure you did it.
Got it. That was really my question, was just on a lot of these things. It's like, are we disqualified? And how would we know? Because some of these are just so specific to CAC.
Yeah.
Anyway, so but that I think that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah. As long as you follow the instructions and you can argue that you followed the instructions, that's what matters, is in my experience with CAC. So if you're looking at them and you're like, hey, you tell me to do this thing, and you'd be like, look, I did it because you told me to do it, then I think you're going to be in the clear. But if not, like if you misfollow instruction, if you don't do something they tell you to do, that's where the worry is.
Got it.
And sorry,
Okay.
I'm dog sitting, so there's a dog in the background.
Love it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And also like feel free to reach out to CAC with those specific questions. If there is something that you're like, hey, I really want to know like the specifics about this. I am not the best expert, right? Like their staff is. Just know they are not fast at getting back to you oftentimes. But we have a month. We have a month and change. So if you are particularly worried about those zip codes, feel free to ask that. But my real sense is that it's a new like kind of side thing that they got mandated. Any other questions before we wrap for today? I know we're a couple minutes over.
I just got a few announcements, but I'm gonna hold off and see if anybody have any last questions before.
No, Trika, I think you should take it away.
All right. So I'm gonna put in the link is our part 2 of the series. It is May 7th. And let me add the Eventbrite link. You guys are open to register now for that. Also, please, if you are applying, please utilize our grant review service, Jesse, ahead of time. So a lot of people will be coming at them throughout this process. So please, hurry up, the faster the better. Just so you can have some support. We have a few new coaches that we're bringing on, and it will be announced this week. So at least by Friday, we will be sending out announcements from new coaches. So we have some additional support for our projects, especially in the realms of grants and financial management. And if you are a affiliate, if you have not received your orientation for onboarding, we have a lot of resources in our member center. I've been tracking projects down, trying to remind them, please sign up for the orientation. It takes 45 minutes. And we will go through all the resources because there may be some things that can help you with the process. I recall that there were some people brought up about venue spaces and looking for spaces. We do offer spaces as well. That is also in the member center. A list of spaces, either discount or free for our affiliates. So once again, please contact me, Treka. Let me put my email in the chat. So if anybody can just please, sign up for these member center orientations so you don't miss anything. And I'm go ahead and put my email in the chat as well. But that is it. And if you're in the San Francisco area, we're having a mixer in person at our office space on May 9th. It starts at 5 o'clock, 5 to 7. So it's open to the public. You can bring a friend and bring yourselves, of course, and your team. So thank you. And thank you, Kyle, for everything.
My pleasure. Thank you, Treka, and thank you all so much for being part of the workshop today.
Thank you, Kyle.
Follow up with you about that one question. Just always a pleasure to do this work with y'all.
Can I ask
Okay.
one quick question? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If we can't make it to the next workshop, is there any way we could access the recording?
Yes.
Okay.
It will be in the member center as well. And if you need any, if you want to know where in the member center, just send me an email and I'll send you the link directly there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Kyle. This is Kirti. It's been a long time. Sorry, I joined late. I'm here at the hospital with my husband, so a lot of stuff has been a lot of stuff's been happening. So I'm going to email you and see when you and I can connect again. Really looking forward to that.
I hope your husband as well.
Thank you, and I'll chat to you soon. Take care. Okay, bye.
And Ralph, I have your email, right? You had emailed me one time before, right? Oh, you're muted.